Are you in your laundry room?
Oh God, yeah, I am very, very, very much so. It's the thing with writing from home. I mean, it's a very limited, there's very limited room in the flat. So yeah, I've been writing from what I guess we call the utility room.
Yeah.
The washing machine is not on though, which is good.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is one of Britain's funniest comedy actors. He's also a writer. He's created his own sitcom this year in the form of Intelligence, which went out on Sky and was starring him and David Schwimmer from Friends. So Nick Mohammed, welcome.
Thank you very much, Krishnan.
Of course, I mean, I call you a comedy actor. I don't know whether that's the right way to call it, to describe you, because, you know, you're a comedian, you do magic, you've got an alter ego.
Yeah.
How do you think of yourself?
A madman? I don't know. I don't know. I think comedy actor is kind of closest to what I would like to be. I don't know what I think I occasionally get described as a writer performer, which sort of performer kind of seems to kind of cover a few bases.
Intelligence was a huge success earlier this year on British TV, and it's now going to America.
Yeah.
For those people that haven't seen it, it stars you and David Schwimmer as, well, you work at GCHQ.
Yeah, so I'm at GCHQ. I'm a very kind of low-ranking junior analyst there. And David plays an NSA officer who's sort of come over on like a secondment. We kind of learn through the series sort of the real reason why he's there. But in the first instance, you learn that he's there as like an NSA liaison who has to sort of work alongside this team who specifically tackles cyber terrorism, cybercrime. And so it focuses on these sort of five odd characters, really. And, you know, it's a very silly show. I mean, I wanted to write a workplace sitcom, but, you know, I just wanted it to be very gaggy and very silly. And it's strange because I never intended it to be sort of satirical in any way. The idea for the show I'd been sort of toying with for a while, but I guess David's character has sort of some kind of Trumpian sort of qualities, which was sort of unintentional, as in I think Donald Trump sort of started just behaving in such a mad way that it just felt strange to kind of be writing a comedy, which was effectively scripted comedy. But if you put real things in that he'd said, then it'd probably be looked at as too extreme or, you know, overwritten maybe.
Given sitcom is such a sort of a British thing, yeah, you know, it must be very, very hard to kind of do well now, given that, you know, the sort of years and years of tradition. So this is the first thing you've created from scratch.
Yeah.
So how did you go about sort of doing it, and how did you make it a success?
You could never really. I mean, you never know if it's going to be a success, and there are so many different ways of I guess calibrating success in terms of what that means. You know, I've always wanted to do. You know, whenever I've written comedy, whether it's live stuff or radio or television in this case, you know, you just want to do, just feels all about communicating your sense of humour, and, you know, the most efficient way to do that and the funniest way to do that. What initially attracted me to the idea of a workplace sitcom was the fact, well, particularly setting it at GCHQ, was just that very kind of base note of the juxtaposition of very sort of quite human individuals with all their kind of quirks and sort of oddness, but this huge backdrop of national security being the sort of stakes. Sorry, you might be able to hear one of my kids in the background.
I can hear a young person
playing outside. I mean, I also, not that it was a conscious choice, but obviously there's been quite a fashion of late, I think, for traditional, what you would, I guess, would call traditional British sitcoms to become, I think, probably more like comedy dramas, in the sense that they are often quite emotional. There's a strong kind of narrative element. Sometimes not that many jokes in, to be fair, and, you know, deliberately. And it's not to take anything away from those shows. A lot of those are brilliant shows. But I very much wanted to write a comedy that was just a barefaced comedy above everything else. And
no, I mean, it is really crammed, you know, with jokes, really, and which, as you say, is quite unusual in sort of modern day
at the moment,
comedy, which tries to be sort of quite, you know, a bit sort of cleverer and sort of deeper in a way. And this kind of sort of reminds me sort of the comedies we grew up watching.
Completely, and that was absolutely my background was watching. I was brought up on Dad's Army, Fawlty Towers, some others do have them, and then later sort of French and Saunders and Reeves and Mortimer, which all of those shows, unequivocally played for laughs, and even things like The Office, and as things became increasingly naturalistic, I guess, you could still not knock the fact that The Office had a huge gag rate in there. But I always wanted to, and will always steer towards writing kind of something funny over, but we want this emotional, heartfelt, sort of meaningful kind of beat. That's not to say I might not write something like that at some point, but I definitely wanted my first foray into something that I had exclusively written myself to just have my sort of stamp on it, which is, I guess, just silly, sort of cartoonish silliness.
And do you have any idea what the intelligence community thought of it?
They did come and see us when they heard about it. When there was a press release announcing the show, they wanted to come and meet me. David wasn't in the country, but the NSA, I think, had got in contact with him as well, or his management. And because these institutions have press arms, and I think they just wanted to make sure they weren't being portrayed in a bad light. We weren't kind of whistleblowing or anything, and of course we're not. And I think as soon as they saw the show, they realised they had zero to worry about, because it's just a very silly sitcom. But there was one point when they were like, we shouldn't say that we've ever met, and in my head I'm like, well, why not? I mean, it's for me as a writer, I learned so much stuff from just meeting them and talking, because they quickly realized that the things that I wanted to focus on were like, what does the canteen sell, and what do people wear, and I mean, one thing that they did say, which I think that they had a specific inquiry, because they naturally employ quite a lot of the neurodiverse community, and they wanted to be sure that we weren't kind of poking fun. I mean, and of course we would never do that, and it would be wrong and horrible to do that. So they wanted to be sure that we weren't kind of portraying those people, that community, in a certain light that would be viewed as derogatory. But I think they soon learned that wasn't, there was no intention of that.
There are some passing gags in there, aren't there, about your character sort of being the diversity hire?
Yeah.
I mean, and you certainly don't labour it, but is that, what were you doing with that? Why did you touch on that?
I touched on it because I don't often touch on race in my comedy. It's increasingly becoming relevant to me personally, and so it creeps in there. It crept into my last live show, where I mentioned it again in passing, and it was broadly to do with me being mistaken for Nish Kumar, who's actually a good friend, and we're at university together, and reviewers and audiences occasionally just getting us confused, and once, unbelievably, someone confusing me for Shappy Kashandy. Anyway, that was on Twitter, but still, it's like, come on, like.
Really, yeah, I mean, it's 2020 and there can still only be one brown comedian.
I know. So it crept in there, I mean, for a number of reasons also, one of the things that I thought was an interesting area was the way that institutions like GCHQ, like the BBC, like the Met Office, like big institutions who are trying to encourage diversity, is that there's always it's just such a tricky subject area, particularly because often the people in those top positions who start having those conversations are usually white men, to be fair. So it's a very, fundamentally, they can't really address it, and they have to kind of talk around it. And I always found that just watching how people in institutions try and sort of handle sensitive subject matter is just, I think an interesting area for comedy, because everyone is so delicately walking around these topics, and no one is daring to say what they either really feel or how they think things should be done, either for fear of offending them, or that their views are just downright offensive in the first place, and they'll just be admitting they are who they are.
What's your own background then?
Whenever I get asked by that, I always say guess, but I won't make a guess, because it's usually if I'm in a cab or something and I get asked that. But my dad is Trinidadian, so he's Indo-Caribbean, so his dad was Indian, and my mum's from Cyprus. Both her parents were Cypriot, so I'm half Cypriot, Greek and half Trinidadian, which no one guesses. So that's often why I get people to guess. But it's funny because I get all the Asian castings, I get all the Middle Eastern castings, I get all the kind of sort of Southern Mediterranean castings occasionally. But I'm British. I was born in Leeds, and so I just see myself as everyone else. I think sort of in my peer group, really.
But what was childhood like? Because your mum and dad are sort of lawyer and medic, is that right?
Yeah, my mum was a GP. She's retired now. My dad was a solicitor. My childhood was great. I mean, magic was a huge part of my childhood. I was into that from very early age, like when I was 4, really.
I was really amused when I read that, because I was also a member of the Junior Northern Magic Circle when I was about 8 years old. Yes, and I went to those sort of magic conventions and saw Ali Bongo and Paul Daniels and all those sorts of things.
Really? I had no idea.
But I got into it through an older boy at school when I was about 8 or 9, and sort of did it for 2 or 3 years, but then wasn't very good, and so sort of gave up. But I found it very exciting.
Yeah, well, I loved it. Well, I was very much part. I mean, I sort of joined the junior section of the Northern Magic Circle, I think when I was 12, maybe. And I started having magic lessons. Like, it was only for a couple of years, but I loved it, and I still love it, and still do it. But I just don't do it professionally as much, just because acting had taken over. But so magic was a huge part. Music, I played violin and piano. But I never thought I would go into acting, certainly not writing. I never thought of myself as a writer. I enjoyed English, and I enjoyed writing like my magic sort of routines and stuff like that. And I guess there were a slight sort of comedy bent to them, but it was still all about the magic, really. And then when I was a student, I would often, do close up at hotels and weddings and stuff to kind of earn money. But it was through being at Cambridge for my postgraduate studies that I joined the Footlights, and then I guess it's one thing that Cambridge does. It does instill you with confidence, well, for better or worse. But it made me think that I could just do comedy and it would be fine. And I had absolutely nothing to go on, really. And it took a long time from graduating from Cambridge to then, I guess, becoming a professional comedian. But there was that, I guess, that sort of step up with having done the Footlights up in Edinburgh and things like that, and having that experience. But I was still temping in an office when I moved to London and stuff, and gigging on an evening, and it was a few years before I turned professional.
And how were you sort of brought up in terms of religion? I mean, are you Muslim? Were you brought up Muslim? Your name instantly leads you to assume that
completely. No, absolutely. And no, I'm not religious. But I mean, neither is my dad. I mean, my dad, I guess, would be Muslim, but he's not. But my mum was Greek Orthodox, and so we were actually. I was baptized Greek Orthodox, and then christened. Then my mum sort of moved away from the Greek Orthodox Church because it was just too much. And then I was confirmed Church of England, and I went to church quite a lot until I was 15, 16.
So you were brought up more Christian than anything else?
Completely, absolutely.
And so did anybody ever say, but his name's Mohammed?
Occasionally. I remember, and we were forced to go to Greek school on Saturdays, much to my sister and I's sort of chagrin. And I remember it being pointed out there. And actually, I remember then they were like, "Oh, is this person being racist for even asking that question?" I was like, "It's literally, it's fine." But yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of times when people have assumed that I've been a Muslim, or there's been often times when I've been interview requests when I've been asked to comment on a particular thing. I'm like, well, I just literally can't add anything to this debate.
I was busted once by the Church of England, where my friend asked me to be godfather to his son, and right. You have to tell the vicar that yes, of course he will bring up my children in the church, and as a Christian. Yeah. And they said, so is he a Christian? And because his name's Krishnan, which is the name of an Indian god. Right. And at which point he sort of had to say, I don't think he is. So names sort of can be a real giveaway, but in your case, it's actually misleading. Is the interesting thing.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and I don't think it's sort of difficult to kind of use it to one's advantage, but occasionally I'll have fun with that, But I remember being asked to go on the BBC Asian Network quite early on in my kind of comedy career, and I was up in Edinburgh, and it was going to be quite good publicity for the show. And they were like, so where are you from? And I was like, well, my mum's actually from Cyprus and my dad's from the Caribbean. So I mean, like, I'm not really Asian in the sense. And they were like, oh, you're Asian enough for us. And so I thought that was quite a good comeback. But there's definitely been times when I think audiences have been maybe expecting a particular style of comedy or a certain subject matters to come up, and that they don't. And again, it's not been a deliberate choice to avoid certain subject areas. If I felt like I had something humorous and original to say about race or having the surname Mohammed and what that brings, I would absolutely, say it and do it. And, it appears in some of my scripts occasionally. But I've often quite liked to sort of, I guess, sort of maybe stand apart from that and sort of dip in when I sort of have my cake and eat it a little bit.
I mean, well, it's really interesting because, I mean, I guess what that means is that you didn't, unlike most Asian kids in the north of England, you didn't grow up with, an Asian culture as such. You didn't. Most of us, were taken off to festivals or, hanging out with other Asian families and all the rest of it. And I guess you didn't have that because none of that tradition was part of your family. So it's totally understandable that you would feel more British than anything else.
Yeah, completely. And I went to, my primary school. Weirdly, I think I was the only non-white pupil in that school, even though it was in inner city Leeds. But my secondary school was completely mixed, and there was no kind of point of we never. I mean, I'm sure it existed, and there was maybe a couple of racist incidents that I can personally remember, but that's not bad in 7 years at that secondary school, and that was back in the 90s. But it was completely mixed at school, and so it never everyone just was English, but English in the sense that we're not Welsh or Scottish or Irish as well. So it never felt like something. And then it's strange because then I went to places when I went to Durham, it was really markedly white. There was no one black in our year. I mean, can you imagine that now? I mean, talk about problems of access in education, but that was like the norm, and it was weird that no one questioned it, but I noticed it.
So when you were starting out in TV, do you feel you were treated differently by commissioners? Did they have expectations of who you were, or were they making assumptions about who you were or what your background was? Or
it's a difficult thing to answer because on the one hand, I'll never know what their kind of, if they view me in a particular way and how that's maybe changed. And I obviously don't want to sound bitter, and particularly because I've been lucky and I've had a good career and things are going well. So it would probably be naive if I didn't realize that maybe some of those earlier castings where it was a small role, but I happened to be not white, so it was kind of useful in a very kind of cliched way to say, from a box ticking point of view, it's like, well, look, this is how we deal with this, and that Nick can do this because Nick can do regional accents, and he happens to not be white, so let's do that. So maybe, but I can't say with absolute certainty. The thing that you notice, and this is not just from my point of view, but anyone can see this if you just look at broadcasting over the broadcasting landscape over the last 5 to 10 years, you just see there are very few lead parts taken by people of color, and if they are, it's usually to tell that diverse story that we've spoken about. Often people of color are restricted to sort of the best friend, or you just hear of horror stories of kind of what channels are looking for in terms of casting, and
just explain what you mean when you say sort of horror stories about what they're looking for.
I think to speak generally that people are often pigeonholed, and actors get it a lot, regardless of color, race, but particularly if you are of color, you're often brought in to not exclusively, but often brought in to suit a particular role, and often it is because the people who ultimately are making those decisions who have written those programs or have commissioned those programs or are casting those programs are not of color. So they don't. So it's not that they are explicitly racist or that they, that they're going out of their way to not include those people. It's just this quite traditional sort of way that they have sort of navigated this process in the past, and that's they feel that they cater for their audience, and it's all very sort of self-sufficient because the audience then get what they commission, and so therefore they see that as a demand, and so they supply that, and it becomes quite circular. And until that cycle is broken in a positive way, then it just sort of keep going, and that's why it's good that reform to a degree is happening. But you could even look at the portrayal of or just sort of women in comedy. I mean, that's in a way far worse. Women make up 50% of the population, 50% of sort of the talent behind TV programming. I can absolutely assure you is not feel. It's so underrepresented.
And why do you think that is?
It's God knows. Well, because it's a male-dominated scene. I mean, frankly, it was at times dangerous to be a woman. I mean, it's horrendous, and only now in 2020 we sort of slightly even entertaining the idea that we can get away from a kind of a lad culture and how that actually might be destructive, within society. Only now, platforms like, even ITV2, which was very openly a male-skewed kind of channel, look at the portrayal of women in shows like The Inbetweeners, which was one of the top British shows of the last 5 years. We all have a responsibility as viewers to be kind of, oh yeah, but we love this. We absolutely love this. This is what we want. It's like, well, okay. And you look at it, with the benefit of hindsight now, and you think, is that really what we're after? And so I don't know. And that's not to slate, listen, I'm good friends with, the guys in The Inbetweeners, and I'm sure if I was offered that show, I would have absolutely grabbed it by the horns. It's not to say that was a bad show by any means to single it out, but it's just, when you look at the landscape as a whole, you can it's all the kind of bits of inequality and that kind of toxicity that has particularly has been shown on particularly recently. It was everywhere and still is, and it just needs to kind of come out. Otherwise there'll never be the kind of equality that we need, in terms of gender and diversity, in terms of race as well.
Because the other thing you've been tweeting about recently is about the crisis of live comedy because of the COVID lockdown. To what extent do you think sort of live comedy has created that sort of laddish macho culture within the industry? A lot of it is quite boozy, late night, male.
Yeah, there absolutely has been a culture that has sort of, there's been a sort of a real supply demand thing for that kind of area. There's sort of stag do kind of like late night, sort of drunken, sort of arguably sort of racist, sort of sexist sort of jokes that have done well in those kind of clubs. I mean, whether it's live comedy per se, because I think I don't, there are definitely examples of comedians within institutions that like comedy venues, which aren't sort of your typical sort of jongleurs kind of bear pit sort of comedy nights, that would say that they are more sophisticated or more kind of avant-garde, more like kind of left field sort of comedy, alternative comedy or whatever, but they're still deeply sexist places. And I feel sort of ashamed to even not have noticed. I mean, when you hear about some of the horrors that have gone on, and, speaking to a lot of female comic friends of mine, and you just realise that it was everywhere.
So how do you change that? I mean, this is something you want to save. Because it's, well, why do you want to save it? Explain that first. I mean, presumably it's just really important in terms of creating the industry and developing talent.
Completely, yeah. I mean, and when I'm talking about live comedy and saving live comedy, I'm obviously not talking about the stuff that has allowed sort of racist and sexist attitudes to sort of just prevail so openly. We're talking about saving the right kind of comics and saving the right attitudes. But live comedy in a nutshell, I mean, there are very few examples of televisual kind of comedies and where there's not been kind of an element that's sort of been born through live performance, from Fawlty Towers, John Cleese being a member of the Footlights, Alan Partridge, Steve Coogan being on the live circuit, so much is born in that live environment because it gives you an opportunity to really experiment and find your voice. And, you just see, the importance of Edinburgh. There is still almost this etiquette that people, especially if you are new, that you go and you showcase your new live hour, and then off the back of that you then have those conversations with TV executives and so on as to kind of your ideas then for television. It definitely feels like it's part of that journey, and I think as soon as if you remove all of that, then you're sort of kind of clutching at straws a little bit.
So at the moment there's no help for comedy, is that right?
Nothing. Zero. And there's also, I also know, again, friends some magicians actually, as well as comedians, who are kind of trapped between that kind of thing. In that I've forgotten what the amount is, but they've had good years they've earned over, I think 50,000 is it, the drop off. So they've not been able to claim for any kind of sort of self-employment help from the government, and that's been tricky because they've not been able to work since March and won't work again until next March probably. And so, but there's been absolutely not, they don't qualify for anything. And so,
do you think, if you put these sort of two threads that we've been talking about together, is there in any way an opportunity for a reset, when sort of live comedy comes back, to sort of, to get the right kind of comedy, if you like, for want of a better phrase?
Well, that's why I think it's been great. So the Live Comedy Association, who only set up, I think, a couple of months ago even, have been making waves, not just in terms of spearheading this Save Live Comedy movement and becoming a kind of a mediator between live comics and live venues and the government and bodies like Arts Council England, but have been doing sterling work in terms of shining a light on how toxic certain live comedy areas have been, and how in terms of misogyny and sexism, racism, and so on. And so it feels like what they're doing has been fantastic, because it does feel like, when live venues are able to open again, there, a light has been shone on all the stuff that is bad about those environments, that will hopefully mean people will at least be able to kind of call it out for what it is, and feel confident to, and the other people, not just the people who it's affecting directly, but other people will be able to say, this is wrong, this shouldn't happen.
Do you think it is wrong and shouldn't happen? How do you feel about the whole sort of, where this crosses over the no platforming, cancel culture debate of sort of freedom of speech, that there ought to be the right to be Bernard Manning or Jim Davidson or whoever, you want to be in a free world?
I don't know. I just think it's so obvious. I think it's so obvious when someone's underlying message is not nice. I think it's so clear when it comes from the wrong place, both whether it's on television. You see fewer examples of that on television now, because obviously broadcasters, don't want to be associated with racism and misogyny, or certainly not outwardly in that kind of way. You should never stop people from saying anything. You can't, I do believe in freedom of speech, but the idea that someone would use comedy to sort of put forward a message of hate or to deride, it just feels gross, and it feels so obvious when I ever see that. I'm like, well, that's obvious, and if people are lapping this up, it probably means that they're not that nice either. I think the interesting kind of grey area, and I think that it's been interesting, particularly with Black Lives Matter and so on, was the rush to kind of cancel shows, such as Little Britain, anything that showcased blackface, and I think it was right in a lot of respects to do that, but again, it just pointed towards the fact that we need to have such a much more nuanced and grown up discussion about this. It felt like it was, the head of those sort of channels and platforms, who are probably almost definitely white, to be like, oh yeah, we've got to let's do they've seen doing the right thing. There was such a rush to do it, and there was, and of course, like I say, it was undoubtedly probably the right thing to do. The question is how that kind of got past sort of all the kind of different filters of programming in the first place, from writing, producing, commissioning, how it was all viewed as absolutely fine up until the point that there's this huge tragedy in the States and a huge movement and brilliant movement coming off the back of it, and then they're like, oh yeah, no, we're going to cancel all these shows on Netflix and BBC. Yeah, we'll take those offshore. Job done. As if that's the real response to it. So, undoubtedly there needs to be far more discussion around that. And if I was to do a French accent or play a French character, would that, is that derogatory? Is that stereotypical? I think there's a conversation to be had about, where the line is drawn about how people are portrayed. But I think that the more I think of it, the more I realize that my wife had a really good analogy to this, and I'm going to probably completely paraphrase it and do it all wrongly. But it's that thing of, if you're the minority group, you can sort of say and do anything because you have had generations of historic abuse, ridicule. I mean, how long's a piece of string? You can just go on and on and on. And so it is your right now to be able to poke fun, but it doesn't work the other way around. If you're part of the generation or the privilege or the racial group who have historically, whether you are or you aren't yourself explicitly racist or kind of hold those kinds of views or not, there has to be an appreciation for, well, if you back down, then you're in dodgy area. You've got to really, really kind of be accountable.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if you think about intelligence, the fact when I watch intelligence, knowing that you've created it is really important. I think,
yes,
because your character in intelligence, who is slightly pathetic, and but you like him, you warm to him, but he's kind of the one who kind of makes you cringe a bit. It's quite important that that's been created by you rather than a white writer.
Completely, and there's been occasions when we've been in a couple of story supervisors on the show who are white, and we'll be going through the script and going through the lines, and they're like, fine, it's fine, Nick can say that because Nick said it, but we couldn't say it. We're not allowed to make. And there has to be that understanding. And the other thing to say just generally is that it's also to do with the strength of the joke, I think, as well. If you've got a really good original joke, tell it. Like, absolutely tell it. Context is so important. But if you have got the perfect, brilliant joke, then absolutely tell it. But be prepared to be scrutinized, especially if you come from the majority group poking fun at minority group. Unless you have found some really brilliant way of finding you're funny in that and it resonating with an audience, then great. But that's why it works so well the other way around. It's because these people who have been so oppressed have got so much to say, and it's like, right, now you can finally listen. Finally, we've got our platform. It doesn't work the other way around as well. But to do with that point, as it being me who wrote intelligence, there was a joke in the show. The concern was that it would be viewed as transphobic. It wasn't transphobic, but there was a mention of someone transgender in it. And the bottom line was there was actually no one transgender on our team, on our creative team. So from producing, writing, script editing, and the execs and commissioners, no one. And so we were like, well, this is not our area. This is not for us to be the judge of whether this is offensive or it's not offensive, or whether we're allowed to say it. We were like, just leave it. It's fine to just leave it. We've got plenty of other jokes. There's an infinite number of jokes that people can tell. And sometimes you do wonder why people sort of stray into territory unnecessarily. It's like, well, fine, if you've got something to say about it, and if it comes from your heart, if it comes from heart, if it comes from a good place, and there's an authenticity to it, which usually means that it's because you've experienced it, or you are it, or then fine, then great. But if not, you better have a bloody good reason as to why you're saying it, or you're going down that path.
I have to just ask you before we get to the end about not having been to America. You were telling me earlier before we started. I mean, you're about the only person I think I've met in the industry who's never been to America. And how is that?
Well, it's odd. I mean, it's just sort of coincidence. So I never went on holiday to America, and I've got family in America and Canada, so I don't know why I've not gone. But in terms of from a work point of view, I got signed with an American agency back in 2012, and so I've been signed with them for a while and still represented by them in the States. And it's strange because there was all the kind of the idea of maybe doing pilot season and kind of going over and doing that kind of thing. And it didn't. I'd had a few friends who'd done it, and it never really appealed to me. Partly because it felt like a bit of a meat market. I mean, I think that it's pretty harsh. I think you're in and out, and you gotta be, you gotta have sort of nerves of steel, really. But also because I think I just I was about to get married, and we wanted to have kids, and now we've got kids, and I just sort of, it felt like a little bit like I didn't want that kind of upheaval so early on, and certainly not without something to really kind of almost prove my worth a little bit. And so intelligence has sort of been the thing that I've been waiting, to have my own example of a TV show that has it will be at in the States as of tomorrow. It felt like, well, if I can then go to States with a really good calling card, and then kind of sort of go for castings or talk about other, maybe writing projects over in the States, that felt like a less risky route than sort of going and being suddenly a complete unknown again, and sort of trying to stand out in that way. So it was more, and it's not like I felt like, oh, I've cracked British comedy, therefore I must go to America. I felt so, and still feel I've got so much more that I want to kind of do and say and put on television and stuff like that. So I felt like, well, there's no rush. I'm still honing my craft. You always are kind of honing it, and I just wanted to wait a little bit. But it is strange because there was a couple of opportunities. Well, one was to do the press for Intelligence, and then another TV show I've done for Apple, which I shot last year, which is an American show. And both times I probably would have had to go out to do the promotion, and I've not been able to because of Corona. So it's a shame in a way, because that would have been quite a nice way to go out. And even when I did like The Martian, the film, and it was set, the bits that I was doing were set in UCLA. And I was like, oh, great, I'm going to get to go to like sunny California. I can't wait. And it's like, no, it was all shot in Budapest in like some industrial unit. And so I just in November, and I was like, oh, this is not what I expected. But, it's all good. And I'm sure I'll go at some point. But just
so do you think American culture is just so universal now that it really doesn't matter if you've never been? You get it?
That's a good question. Again, I don't know the answer, because until I guess I go, I won't know what I've missed, maybe. But I mean, in terms of immersing myself in, when I've discussed with American networks about the kind of show that I want to write, we're all talking about the same shows, because there's so much crossover now. All the Americans watching British shows, and all the Brits are watching American shows. There's not. It's one of the questions we got asked quite a lot doing the promo for Intelligence in the States was how do you find sort of balancing the two different types of humor? And I was like, well, I don't know if you can kind of categorize them in that way, because there's, we adore Friends, say, and you guys adore Fleabag. I mean, they're not the only two examples, but it's just if something's funny, it'll find its audience who like that kind of funny, regardless of where they are, I think. So I definitely don't think I've got a complete hold on American culture in one sense, because I've never been there and I will only know when I go. But then in terms of, there's a lot of American funny shows that I watch, and I know that I enjoy those and laugh at those, and if I can emulate some of those, then all the better, really.
So having said that you're not really trying to change the world, suppose you could just wave the magic wand.
Right.
And in your case, it really would be. What would you do?
Okay, well, a vaccine, I think, has probably got to be the first one. I'd make the world a more equal place. Well, a completely equal place. But in doing so, I think there would always have to be a recognition that it wasn't always equal, and why it was allowed, why that was allowed to continue for so long. You can't just, I don't think you can realistically and practically just sort of wipe the slate clean in that way. There needs to be an acknowledgement, because there's just so much history. There's so much history that you can't ignore. But I would make the world an equal place. And a creative place, and just remove anything that feels it goes back to the thing I was saying before. It feels so obvious to me when someone is doing something out of spite, or is being a bully, or there's a meanness attached to a certain, whether it be turn of phrase or action or policy or anything, or just it's very obvious when something is so unsympathetic. I'd sort of just try and eradicate that from kind of human nature, and it is obviously a part of human nature. I think that would help make the world a better place in some respects, if we could all empathise with each other a little bit more. There's a great, I've forgotten who said it, I think it's called the overview effect, and it was like a psychological phenomenon experienced by astronauts, this thing called the overview effect. And it's basically when you can view the curvature of the Earth, and only astronauts obviously really get to experience it, you just have this dawning realization, like, oh my goodness, like how lucky we are to be on this sort of just this planet Earth, and that it makes us all equal. It's like human beings are just equal, and all of those political differences, you don't see political borders, you don't see even geographic borders, but you just see just this planet and these land masses in this ocean, and I think it's apparently a deeply kind of sort of spiritual moment that only, as I say, only astronauts really kind of get to experience. But they were saying if world leaders, if humankind could all experience this, they would realise that suddenly all their petty differences and some of these grievances and all that would just go, because there'd just be this sort of deeper understanding of who we are.
Nick Mohammed, thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you for sharing your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed watching or listening to that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.